The sound of my father's voice echoing through the marble foyer should have been welcoming me home for Christmas dinner. Instead, his words made my blood turn to ice as I stood there in my red velvet dress, holding the homemade cranberry sauce I'd spent hours perfecting. "You're not welcome here anymore, Jessica. This family has standards and you've chosen to disgrace the Hamilton name for the last time. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you." I stared at Richard Hamilton, the man who had raised me, taught me to ride horses, and walked me down the aisle just 2 years ago. The same man who now stood in the doorway of our family's sprawling estate in Marin County, California, blocking my entrance to the Christmas celebration happening behind him. Through the tall windows, I could see my stepmother Patricia arranging flowers, my half-brother Marcus mixing cocktails, and my stepsister Victoria setting the dining room table with our grandmother's china. The scene looked like something from a holiday magazine, perfect and pristine, except for one glaring detail: I was being excluded from it. My name is Jessica Hamilton Chen, and until that moment on Christmas Eve 2023, I had believed I was part of one of Northern California's most successful business families. At 28 years old, I was a forensic accountant with my own practice, married to David Chen, a brilliant software engineer, and living what I thought was a charmed life in our Victorian home in San Francisco's Pacific Heights neighborhood. I had graduated summa cum laude from UC Berkeley with a degree in accounting and finance, earned my CPA certification, and built a reputation for uncovering financial irregularities that other accountants miss. What I didn't know was that my expertise in detecting financial deception would soon be turned toward my own family's business empire, revealing secrets that would shatter everything I thought I knew about the Hamilton legacy and my place within it. The Hamilton Industrial Group had been founded in 1987 by my father Richard, starting as a small manufacturing company that produced specialized components for the aerospace industry. Over the past 36 years, under my father's leadership, it had grown into a diversified conglomerate with divisions in manufacturing, real estate development, technology consulting, and renewable energy. The company employed over 3,000 people across California, Nevada, and Oregon, generating annual revenues that consistently exceeded $200 million. I had grown up hearing stories about my father's business acumen, his ability to identify promising opportunities and turn small investments into major successes. The company's headquarters occupied a sleek glass building in downtown San Francisco, and Richard Hamilton was frequently quoted in business publications as an example of entrepreneurial success and ethical leadership. He served on the boards of several charitable organizations, had been named California Businessman of the Year twice, and was known throughout the Bay Area as someone who combined business success with community service. My relationship with my father had always been complicated, shaped by the fact that I was the product of his first marriage to my mother, Elena Chen, a brilliant mathematician who had immigrated from Taiwan in the early 90s. My parents had met when my father was just starting his business, and my mother was completing her PhD in applied mathematics at Stanford. Their marriage had lasted 7 years, ending in what I was told was an amicable divorce when I was 5 years old. My mother had retained her married name professionally but had insisted that I carry both Hamilton and Chen as my surname, honoring both sides of my heritage. She had moved to Boston after the divorce to accept a position at MIT, visiting California regularly and maintaining a close relationship with both my father and me. My memories of those early years were filled with warmth and intellectual curiosity, as both my parents encouraged my love of numbers and problem solving. When my father remarried Patricia Sinclair 2 years after the divorce, I was 7 years old and initially excited about having a new mother and sibling. Patricia was a former marketing executive who had worked for several high-profile tech companies before meeting my father at a charity fundraiser. She brought with her 2 children from her previous marriage, Marcus, who was 3 years older than me, and Victoria, who was 1 year younger. The blended family had seemed to work well initially. Patricia was welcoming and inclusive, making sure I felt equally valued alongside her biological children. Marcus and Victoria accepted me as their sister without hesitation, and we spent summers traveling together as a family, skiing in Tahoe in the winter, and celebrating holidays with elaborate traditions that Patricia loved to orchestrate. As we grew older, however, subtle dynamics began to emerge that I didn't fully understand at the time. Marcus showed little interest in the family business, preferring to pursue his passion for music and eventually becoming a successful sound engineer for recording studios in Los Angeles. Victoria developed interests in fashion and social media, launching a lifestyle blog that had gained modest success but required financial support from the family. I, on the other hand, had inherited both my mother's analytical mind and my father's business instinct. From an early age, I was fascinated by how companies operated, how financial systems worked, and how numbers could tell stories about success and failure. During high school, I spent summers working at Hamilton Industrial Group, starting in entry-level positions, and gradually taking on more responsibility as I learned different aspects of the business. My father seemed genuinely proud of my interest and aptitude for business. He would bring me to board meetings as an observer, explain complex financial decisions during our car rides to work, and encourage me to ask questions about strategy and operation. By the time I graduated from high school, I was already familiar with most aspects of the company's operations and had developed strong relationships with many of the senior executives. During my college years at UC Berkeley, I majored in accounting and finance, while also taking courses in business law and organizational management. I spent summers working in different departments of Hamilton Industrial Group, gaining experience in manufacturing operations, financial analysis, human resources, and strategic planning. My father frequently told colleagues that I was being groomed to eventually take over leadership of the company, and I felt deeply honored by his confidence in my ability. After graduation, however, my father encouraged me to gain experience working outside the family business, before returning to Hamilton Industrial Group in a senior role. I spent 3 years working for a large accounting firm in San Francisco, specializing in forensic accounting and fraud detection. The work was fascinating and challenging, involving investigations of complex financial schemes, embezzlement cases, and corporate fraud. I developed expertise in analyzing financial records, identifying suspicious patterns, and presenting findings in court proceedings. My success in forensic accounting led to opportunities to work on high-profile cases involving major corporations, and I eventually decided to start my own practice specializing in financial investigations for law firms and corporations. The decision to become an independent consultant was both professionally and personally satisfying, allowing me to choose my clients and focus on cases that interested me most. Throughout this period, my relationship with my father remained strong and supportive. He was proud of my professional achievements and frequently mentioned my success to business associates and friends. We had regular dinners together, and he continued to seek my advice on financial matters related to Hamilton Industrial Group, treating me as a trusted advisor even though I wasn't formally employed by the company. Patricia had also been consistently warm and supportive, treating me as her own daughter and including me in all family activities and celebrations. Marcus and Victoria and I maintained close relationships, despite our different career paths and interests. Family holidays were elaborate affairs, with Patricia orchestrating elaborate decorations, multiple course meals, and carefully planned activities that created lasting memories. The first sign that something might be changing in our family dynamics came during Thanksgiving 2023, just 1 month before the Christmas incident that would alter everything. During dinner, my father had made several comments about responsibility, loyalty, and the importance of maintaining family traditions and values. At the time, I had assumed he was speaking generally about the challenges of maintaining a successful business and close family relationship. However, I noticed that Patricia seemed unusually tense during the evening, and both Marcus and Victoria appeared uncomfortable when my father spoke about family obligations and expectations. There were several moments when conversations became awkward or were quickly changed to lighter topics, but I attributed this to normal family stress during holiday gatherings. 2 weeks after Thanksgiving, I received a phone call from my father asking me to meet him for lunch at his private club in downtown San Francisco. This wasn't unusual, as we regularly met for meals to catch up on personal and professional matters. However, his tone seemed more formal than usual, and he insisted that we meet at the club rather than one of our usual casual restaurants. During lunch, my father seemed distracted and somewhat distant. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Asking about my work and my marriage to David in ways that felt more like an interview than a family conversation. When I asked about his mood and whether anything was bothering him, he assured me that everything was fine and that he was simply dealing with some complex business decisions that required his full attention. As we were finishing dessert, my father mentioned that he and Patricia were planning some changes to their holiday traditions this year, including possibly scaling back the elaborate Christmas celebration that had been a family tradition for over 20 years. When I offered to help with planning or to contribute financially to the celebration, he quickly declined, saying that Patricia had everything under control and that they were looking forward to a quieter, more intimate gathering. The conversation left me feeling unsettled, though I couldn't pinpoint exactly why. My father's behavior wasn't dramatically different, but there were subtle changes in his tone and demeanor that suggested something significant was happening beneath the surface. When I mentioned the conversation to David that evening, he suggested that perhaps my father was dealing with business stress or health concerns that he didn't want to burden the family with. 3 days before Christmas, I called Patricia to ask if there was anything I could bring to Christmas dinner and to confirm the timing for the celebration. Patricia's response was surprisingly brief and somewhat cold, very different from her usual enthusiastic approach to holiday planning. She told me that she would call me back with details but never did, leaving me to assume that the celebration would follow the usual schedule and format. On Christmas Eve morning, I spent hours preparing homemade cranberry sauce using a recipe that had been passed down from my grandmother, my father's mother, who had died when I was 15. The recipe was special to our family and I had made it every year since my grandmother's death as a way of honoring her memory and contributing something meaningful to our Christmas tradition. David and I had planned to arrive at my father's estate around 4 o'clock in the afternoon, as had been our custom for the past several years. We dressed carefully for the occasion, with David wearing a navy suit and myself in a red velvet dress that Patricia had complimented during previous holiday celebration. I packed the cranberry sauce in a beautiful serving bowl and included a small gift for each family member, continuing traditions that had always been important to our family gathering. As we drove through the winding roads of Marin County toward my father's estate, I felt the usual excitement and anticipation that always accompanied family gathering. The house, a stunning Mediterranean-style villa set on 15 acres of landscaped grounds, had been purchased by my father 10 years earlier as his business success allowed for increasingly luxurious lifestyle choices. The property included formal gardens, a tennis court, a swimming pool and guest quarters that could accommodate extended family visits. However, as we approached the front entrance, I noticed that my father was standing in the doorway rather than greeting us in the living room as was his usual custom. His posture was rigid and formal and his expression was serious rather than welcoming. Patricia was visible through the windows, but she didn't come to the door to greet us, which was unusual given her typically warm and enthusiastic hosting style. When my father spoke those words about not being welcome and disgracing the Hamilton name, I felt as though the ground had shifted beneath my feet. David immediately stepped closer to me, sensing the tension and preparing to support me through whatever was about to unfold. I could see my father's jaw set in determination, and I realized that this was not a spontaneous decision, but something he had planned and rehearsed. "Dad, what are you talking about?" I managed to say, though my voice sounded strange and distant to my own ear. "What have I done to disgrace the family name? I don't understand what's happening." My father's expression didn't soften, and his response was delivered in the cold, business-like tone he typically reserved for dealing with difficult employees or contractors. "You know exactly what you've done, Jessica. Your investigation into the Morrison Industries case has put our family's reputation at risk, and I won't tolerate it any longer." The mention of the Morrison Industries case sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the December weather. Morrison Industries was a client I had been investigating for the past 6 months, hired by their board of directors to examine financial irregularities that had been discovered during a routine audit. The case had revealed a complex web of financial manipulation, hidden assets, and fraudulent reporting that went far deeper than anyone had initially suspected. What my father couldn't have known was that during my investigation of Morrison Industries, I had discovered financial connections and business relationships that seemed to link back to Hamilton Industrial Group in ways that didn't make sense based on what I knew about my father's business operation. I had been planning to discuss these findings with my father after the holidays, assuming there was a reasonable explanation that would clarify the apparent connection. The Morrison case is a professional engagement, I said carefully, trying to understand how my father even knew about my work on what should have been a confidential investigation. I'm bound by client confidentiality, and I haven't discussed any details with anyone outside the investigation team. How do you even know about my involvement? My father's laugh was harsh and bitter, unlike any sound I had ever heard from him before. You think you're so clever with your forensic accounting and your investigation skills, he said, but you have no idea how many people you've put at risk with your meddling. Some things are more important than your professional ethics, Jessica. Some things require loyalty to family above everything else. The conversation was becoming increasingly surreal, and I felt David's hand on my back, steadying me as I tried to process what was happening. Through the windows behind my father, I could see Marcus and Victoria watching our exchange with expressions of discomfort and concern. Patricia had disappeared from view, apparently unwilling to witness whatever confrontation was unfolding at the front door. I still don't understand what you're saying, I replied, fighting to keep my voice steady. My work on the Morrison case has been completely professional and confidential. I haven't done anything that could possibly affect our family or your business. Can we please go inside and discuss this calmly? My father shook his head firmly. There's nothing to discuss. You've made your choice, and now you have to live with the consequence. You're not welcome in this house until you withdraw from the Morrison investigation and ensure that any findings related to Hamilton Industrial Group are permanently buried. The specific mention of Hamilton Industrial Group in connection with the Morrison investigation sent shockwaves through my understanding of what was happening. Until that moment, I had been operating under the assumption that my father's anger was based on some misunderstanding about my professional work or perhaps concern about general family reputation. The revelation that he knew about specific findings related to his own company suggested something far more serious and complex. Dad, if there's some connection between Hamilton Industrial Group and Morrison Industries that you're concerned about, we should discuss it openly, I said, trying to maintain a professional tone despite the emotional chaos I was feeling. If there are legitimate business relationships that need to be protected, I'm sure we can find a way to handle the situation that protects everyone's interest. My father's expression grew even colder, and I saw something in his eyes that I had never seen before, a combination of fear and rage that made him seem like a stranger rather than the man who had raised me. You're not going to handle anything, he said firmly. You're going to withdraw from the case immediately and forget anything you think you've discovered. If you don't, you'll find out just how little the Hamilton name means when it comes to protecting you from the consequences of your action. The threat was unmistakable, and it fundamentally altered my understanding of who my father was and what our relationship had really been built upon. The man who had encouraged my career, supported my education, and claimed to be proud of my professional achievements, was now threatening me for doing exactly the kind of work he had always praised. David finally spoke, his voice tight with controlled anger. Miss Hamilton, I think you need to step back and consider what you're saying to your daughter. Jessica has done nothing wrong, and threatening her professional reputation is completely unacceptable. My father turned his cold gaze toward David, and I saw contempt in his expression that made my heart sink. This is a family matter, David. It doesn't concern you, and I suggest you stay out of it if you know what's good for your own career. The threat toward David crystallized something in my mind that had been building throughout the conversation. This wasn't about family loyalty or professional ethics. This was about my father using his power and influence to cover up something that could be exposed through my investigation of Morrison Industries. The man I had trusted and admired my entire life was asking me to compromise my professional integrity to protect him from consequences I didn't yet fully understand. I won't withdraw from the Morrison case, I said, surprised by the steadiness of my own voice. If you're concerned about legitimate business connections, we can address those concerns through proper legal channels, but I won't compromise an investigation that could reveal fraud or other illegal activities, regardless of who might be affected." My father's face flushed with anger, and he stepped forward in a way that felt threatening and intimidating. "Then you've made your choice," he said coldly. "You're no longer welcome in this family, and you'll find that your decision has consequences far beyond what you can imagine." He stepped back into the house and began to close the door, but before it shut completely, I heard Patricia's voice calling my name from somewhere inside the house. There was pain and conflict in her voice, suggesting that whatever was happening had been planned without her full agreement or understanding. The door closed with a final decisive sound that seemed to echo through the winter air. David and I stood on the front steps of my father's house, holding the homemade cranberry sauce and small wrapped gifts, feeling like actors in a play where the script had suddenly changed without warning. The house behind the closed door was filled with light and warmth and the sounds of family celebration, but we were now excluded from a tradition that had been central to my identity for over 20 years. As we walked back to our car, I felt David's hand slip into mine, providing the anchor of stability I desperately needed, as my understanding of my family and my place within it completely shifted. The drive home to San Francisco passed in relative silence, both of us processing the magnitude of what had just occurred, and trying to understand the implications for our future. That evening, as we sat in our own living room, surrounded by the Christmas decorations we had carefully chosen and arranged, I began to examine my memories of the past few months, with the analytical skills I used in my professional investigation. The conversation with my father had revealed connections between Hamilton Industrial Group and Morrison Industries that I had noted but not fully investigated. My father's specific knowledge of my work on the case suggested monitoring or surveillance that went beyond normal business intelligence. Most disturbing was the realization that my father's reaction wasn't that of someone who was surprised by potential business connections or concerned about reputational damage. His response had been that of someone who knew exactly what I might discover and was desperately trying to prevent that discovery from becoming public knowledge. Over the next several days, as David and I spent a quiet Christmas together, and I processed the emotional impact of being rejected by my family, I also began to methodically review everything I knew about the Morrison Industries investigation and its potential connections to Hamilton Industrial Group. What I discovered during those long winter days between Christmas and New Year's would reveal a web of deception that went far deeper than I had ever imagined. The Morrison Industries case had begun as a relatively straightforward investigation into accounting irregularities that had been discovered during a routine audit. The company's board of directors had hired my firm to examine financial records and determine whether there was evidence of fraud or embezzlement that needed to be reported to authorities. Morrison Industries was a mid-sized manufacturing company that produced components for various industries, including aerospace, automotive, and industrial equipment. During my initial review of Morrison's financial records, I had identified several transactions that seemed unusual in their structure and documentation. There were payments to consulting companies that didn't appear to provide actual services, transfers of funds between accounts that served no apparent business purpose, and contracts with suppliers that seemed overpriced compared to industry standards. As I dug deeper into these irregularities, I discovered that many of the suspicious transactions involved companies that were connected through a complex network of shell corporations and holding companies. The web of relationships was deliberately obscured through multiple layers of corporate entities, making it difficult to trace the ultimate ownership and control of the various companies involved. One name that appeared repeatedly throughout this network was Hamilton Holdings, an investment company that I had assumed was unrelated to my father's business empire. Hamilton Industrial Group was publicly known to be owned by my father through a straightforward corporate structure, and I had never heard of Hamilton Holdings in connection with the family business. However, as I traced the financial relationships more carefully, I began to see patterns that suggested Hamilton Holdings and Hamilton Industrial Group were more closely connected than their separate corporate structures would suggest. There were transfers of funds between the companies that couldn't be explained by normal business relationships, shared vendors and consultants that served both organizations, and coordination of major business decisions that indicated common ownership or control. The discovery that my father might have been operating a parallel business empire through Hamilton Holdings was shocking enough on its own, but as I continued my investigation, I uncovered evidence that suggested something even more disturbing about the true ownership and control of Hamilton Industrial Group itself. According to the corporate records I had access to through my investigation, my father was listed as the primary owner and chief executive officer of Hamilton Industrial Group. However, as the financial flows I was tracking suggested that significant portions of the company's profits were being diverted to accounts controlled by Hamilton Holdings, reducing the apparent value and success of Hamilton Industrial Group while enriching the shadowy network of companies that seemed to be the real beneficiaries of the business empire's success. What made this discovery particularly personal was the realization that my father's treatment of me as his heir apparent to Hamilton Industrial Group might have been an elaborate deception. If the real value and control of the business empire lay with Hamilton Holdings and its network of associated companies, then my father's promises about my future role in the family business were meaningless. Even more troubling was the possibility that my expertise in forensic accounting had been encouraged and developed by my father not because he was proud of my skills, but because he needed someone within the family who could help maintain and protect the complex financial structures he had created. My professional success might have been seen as a valuable asset for covering up rather than exposing financial irregularity. As these realizations accumulated over the days following Christmas, I felt a growing sense of betrayal that went beyond the immediate pain of being excluded from family celebration. Everything I thought I knew about my father, my family, and my own identity was being called into question by evidence that suggested systematic deception spanning decades. But alongside the personal pain, I also felt a professional obligation to continue my investigation and uncover the full extent of what appeared to be a sophisticated financial fraud. The Morrison Industries case had revealed the tip of what might be a much larger iceberg, and my training as a forensic accountant compelled me to follow the evidence wherever it led, regardless of the personal cost. The decision to continue investigating despite my father's threats and the loss of my family relationships was difficult but ultimately clear. The principles that had guided my professional life, the commitment to uncovering truth and preventing fraud, were more important than maintaining family harmony based on deception and criminal activity. What I didn't know as I made that decision was that the investigation would eventually reveal that the true ownership of Hamilton Industrial Group, the company I had been raised to believe would someday be mine, rested not with my father but with someone whose identity would shock me, even more than discovering his web of financial deception. The new year arrived with a determination I had never felt before. While David returned to his software engineering projects, I threw myself into the Morrison Industries investigation with an intensity that bordered on obsession. Every spreadsheet, every bank record, every corporate filing became a piece of a puzzle that I was determined to solve completely, regardless of where the evidence led me. My home office, which had previously been a comfortable space for managing my consulting practice, transformed into something resembling a detective's war room. I covered the walls with printouts of corporate organizational charts, timelines of suspicious transactions, and photographs of key documents. David had installed a large whiteboard where I mapped connections between the various companies, using different colored markers to trace the flow of money through the complex network of entities. The deeper I dug into Hamilton Holdings and its connections to Morrison Industries, the more sophisticated the deception appeared. Whoever had designed this financial structure possessed both intimate knowledge of corporate law and extensive experience in hiding assets from regulatory oversight. The shell companies were incorporated in different states, the bank accounts were spread across multiple financial institutions, and the timing of transactions was carefully coordinated to avoid triggering automatic reporting requirements. What made the investigation particularly challenging was that much of the evidence I needed was held by financial institutions and government agencies that required subpoenas or court orders to release records. As a private investigator working for Morrison Industries' board of directors, I had access to internal company records, but limited ability to compel disclosure from external sources. However, my years of experience in forensic accounting had taught me how to piece together complex financial puzzles using publicly available information, combined with careful analysis of patterns and relationships. Corporate filings with state agencies, property records, professional licensing databases, and business registration documents all contained pieces of information that could be assembled into a comprehensive picture of the hidden financial network. 3 weeks into January, I made a discovery that fundamentally changed my understanding of the scope of the deception I was investigating. While researching the incorporation documents for one of the shell companies connected to Hamilton Holdings, I found the name of the registered agent who had filed the paperwork. The agent was Patricia Sinclair, using her maiden name and listing an address that I recognized as her previous residence before marrying my father. The realization that my stepmother was involved in the financial network I was investigating sent shockwaves through my already fragile understanding of my family relationship. Patricia had always presented herself as someone with limited involvement in business matters, preferring to focus on social activities and charitable work. The idea that she was sophisticated enough to serve as a registered agent for shell companies suggested either that I had completely misjudged her capabilities, or that someone else was using her identity for their own purpose. I spent the next several days carefully researching Patricia's background and professional history, using the same investigative techniques I employed for clients. What I discovered painted a very different picture of my stepmother than the one I had grown up with. Before meeting my father, Patricia hadn't just worked in marketing for tech companies. She had been a senior financial analyst specializing in mergers and acquisitions, with particular expertise in complex corporate restructuring and international finance. Her professional resume included positions at several major investment banks and consulting firms, where she had worked on transactions involving billions of dollars in assets. She held an MBA from Wharton and had been licensed as a certified financial analyst before stepping away from her career after marrying my father. The woman I had known as someone who enjoyed arranging flowers and planning dinner parties was actually a highly sophisticated financial professional with exactly the skills needed to design and manage the complex corporate network I was investigating. The discovery of Patricia's hidden expertise made me reconsider everything I thought I knew about the power dynamics within my family. I had always assumed that my father was the driving force behind Hamilton Industrial Group's success and that Patricia played a supporting role focused on family and social activity. The evidence I was uncovering suggested that Patricia might be the actual architect of the financial strategies that had built and concealed the family's true wealth. As I continued researching Patricia's involvement, I found additional evidence of her role in the network of shell companies. Her name appeared as an officer or board member of several entities. Her electronic signature was on numerous corporate filings, and bank records showed regular transfers between accounts she controlled and the main Hamilton Holdings structure. The financial flows suggested that she wasn't just a passive participant, but an active manager of the system. Even more disturbing was the discovery that Patricia had been systematically transferring assets and control of various entities to Marcus and Victoria over the past several years. Corporate records showed that both of my step-siblings had been granted ownership stakes in multiple companies within the network, giving them access to wealth and power that far exceeded what I had understood about their roles in the family business. Marcus, whom I had always known as someone uninterested in business matters and focused on his music career, was listed as the majority owner of 3 different companies that appeared to be major players in the hidden financial network. Victoria, who had seemed content with her lifestyle blog and social media activities, controlled companies that owned significant real estate holdings and investment portfolios. The realization that my step-siblings had been secretly building substantial wealth and business empires while I focused on my independent career was both shocking and illuminating. It explained some of the tension I had sensed during recent family gatherings and provided context for my father's confidence in threatening my access to family resources. But the most devastating discovery came when I found incorporation documents for a company called Elena Holdings, named after my mother. The company had been established just 2 years after my parents' divorce, and its initial funding had come from transfers of assets that had previously belonged to Hamilton Industrial Group. Over the years, Elena Holdings had grown into one of the largest entities in the hidden network, controlling major real estate developments, technology investments, and manufacturing operations. The use of my mother's name for a shell company in my father's financial network felt like a personal violation that went beyond mere business deception. It suggested that my father had been using my mother's identity and possibly her reputation to legitimize his hidden activity. Even worse, it raised questions about whether my mother had been aware of and involved in these activities, or whether she had been another victim of my father's deception. I immediately called my mother in Boston, something I had been hesitant to do since the Christmas confrontation because I hadn't wanted to burden her with family drama during the holiday season. When I explained what I had discovered about Elena Holdings and asked whether she had any knowledge of the company, her response was immediate and emphatic. "Jessica, I have never heard of Elena Holdings, and I certainly never gave permission for anyone to use my name for a business entity," my mother said, her voice tight with anger. "If your father has been using my identity for his business activities without my knowledge or consent, that's identity theft and potentially criminal fraud." My mother's reaction confirmed what I had hoped but feared to assume. She was as much a victim of my father's deception as I was, and the violation of using her name for his hidden financial activities added another layer of criminal behavior to what I was investigating. My mother, with her mathematics background and analytical mind, immediately understood the implications of what I was describing and offered to help with the investigation in any way she could. Over the following weeks, my mother and I worked together to trace the history of Elena Holdings and its connections to the larger financial network. My mother's mathematical expertise proved invaluable in analyzing the complex financial relationships, and her emotional distance from the situation allowed her to see patterns that I might have missed due to my personal involvement. What we discovered was that Elena Holdings served as a central hub for the entire hidden financial network, receiving profits from numerous other entities and redistributing them according to a carefully designed structure that maximized tax benefits while minimizing regulatory oversight. The company controlled assets worth tens of millions of dollars, including properties, investments, and business interests that generated substantial ongoing income. More importantly, we found evidence that the creation of Elena Holdings had coincided with the systematic stripping of assets from Hamilton Industrial Group. Over the course of more than 20 years, my father had been transferring the most valuable parts of his publicly known business empire to the hidden network, leaving Hamilton Industrial Group as essentially a shell company that maintained the appearance of success while the real wealth accumulated elsewhere. The implications of this discovery were staggering. The company that I had been raised to believe would someday be my inheritance was actually a hollowed-out entity with minimal real value. The true wealth that had been built using Hamilton Industrial Group's reputation and business relationships had been systematically diverted to benefit Patricia, Marcus, and Victoria while excluding me entirely from any real ownership or control. But perhaps most shocking of all was the realization that the entire structure appeared to have been designed from the beginning to eventually transfer control to Patricia's children, while cutting me out of my family's actual wealth. The timing of various corporate changes, the evolution of ownership structures, and the pattern of asset transfers all suggested a long-term plan to ensure that Marcus and Victoria would inherit the real family fortune, while I received only the empty shell of Hamilton Industrial Group. This discovery prompted me to dig even deeper into the historical corporate records, searching for the moment when the deception had begun and trying to understand whether I had ever been intended to inherit anything real from my father's business empire. What I found in the archives of corporate filings told a story that was even more disturbing than what I had already uncovered. The first shell companies in the network had been established within months of my father's marriage to Patricia, suggesting that the plan to create a hidden financial empire had been part of their relationship from the beginning. Over the years, the network had grown more sophisticated and more extensive, but the basic structure had remained consistent. Valuable assets were transferred out of Hamilton Industrial Group and into entities controlled by Patricia and her children. The financial records showed that this process had accelerated significantly during my college years and early career, when I was focused on my education and professional development, and paying less attention to the details of my father's business operation. By the time I had developed the expertise to potentially detect what was happening, the most valuable assets had already been moved beyond my reach. Even more disturbing was the discovery that my father had used my own professional success and reputation to legitimize some of the financial activity. My name appeared on several consulting agreements where I had supposedly provided financial analysis services to companies in the network, despite having no memory of doing any such work. The fees for these supposed services had been substantial, but the money had been deposited directly into accounts controlled by Elena Holdings rather than being paid to me personally. The realization that my father had been forging my professional involvement in his financial network was both personally devastating and potentially damaging to my career. If regulatory authorities or professional licensing boards discovered that my name was associated with financial activities I hadn't actually performed, I could face disciplinary action or criminal charges despite being a victim of identity theft. This discovery prompted me to contact my professional liability insurance carrier and the California Board of Accountancy to report that my identity had been used without my permission for business activities that I hadn't actually performed. Both organizations took the matter seriously and began their own investigations into the scope of the identity theft and its potential impact on my professional standing. By early February, the scope of what I had uncovered had grown far beyond the original Morrison Industries investigation. I was now dealing with evidence of a multi-decade conspiracy involving identity theft, corporate fraud, tax evasion, and systematic asset stripping that had affected multiple companies and numerous individuals. The complexity of the case had reached a level that required law enforcement involvement and potentially federal prosecution. I contacted the Federal Bureau of Investigation's White Collar Crime Division and provided them with a comprehensive summary of my findings along with copies of all the documentation I had assembled. The FBI agent assigned to the case, Special Agent Maria Rodriguez, had extensive experience investigating complex financial crimes and immediately recognized the significance of what I had discovered. Ms. Chan, what you've uncovered appears to be one of the most sophisticated long-term financial fraud schemes I've encountered, Agent Rodriguez told me during our first meeting. The level of planning and coordination required to maintain this network for over 20 years suggests that we're dealing with individuals who have extensive knowledge of financial law and regulatory systems. Agent Rodriguez explained that the FBI would need to conduct their own investigation using resources and legal authorities that weren't available to private investigators. They would be able to obtain search warrants for financial records, interview witnesses under oath, and coordinate with other federal agencies to trace the full extent of the financial network. The FBI investigation would necessarily take months or even years to complete, but Agent Rodriguez assured me that they would work to protect my interests and ensure that I wasn't held responsible for any fraudulent activities that had been conducted using my identity. She also explained that I might be eligible for federal witness protection programs if my family members attempted to retaliate against me for cooperating with law enforcement. The possibility of entering witness protection was sobering and highlighted the potential danger of my situation. By uncovering and reporting my father's financial crimes, I had essentially declared war on people who had demonstrated their willingness to use sophisticated deception and potentially illegal activities to protect their interests. My father's threats during the Christmas confrontation now seemed less like emotional outbursts and more like calculated warnings from someone who understood exactly how much he had to lose. David and I had several serious conversations about the risks we were facing and the precautions we needed to take to protect ourselves during the investigation. We installed additional security systems in our home, varied our daily routines to make them less predictable, and established communication protocols with law enforcement in case we felt threatened or noticed unusual activity around our property. The emotional toll of the investigation was as challenging as the physical security concerns. I was simultaneously grieving the loss of my family relationships and feeling anger about the systematic deception that had shaped my entire life. The father I had loved and admired had never really existed. He had been a carefully constructed persona designed to hide criminal activities and manipulate my loyalty and trust. Patricia, whom I had considered a loving stepmother, was revealed to be the primary architect of a scheme that had stolen my inheritance and used my identity to commit crime. Marcus and Victoria, my supposed siblings, had been complicit in a plan that excluded me from family wealth while enriching themselves through fraudulent activity. The sense of betrayal was overwhelming, but it was accompanied by a growing determination to ensure that justice was served and that the victims of my family's crimes were protected. The Morrison Industries investigation had revealed that the financial network had been used to defraud numerous other companies and individuals over the years, causing financial harm that extended far beyond my own family's situation. In March, Agent Rodriguez contacted me with news that the FBI investigation had uncovered additional evidence that significantly expanded the scope of the case. Through their access to banking records and corporate filings, they had identified dozens of additional shell companies and traced financial flows that totaled over $100 million in potentially fraudulent activity. We're now looking at what appears to be one of the largest and most sophisticated corporate fraud networks we've investigated on the West Coast. Agent Rodriguez explained, "Your family members weren't just hiding assets and evading taxes. They were actively defrauding investors, lenders, and business partners through a complex web of false representations and fabricated financial documentation." The expanded investigation revealed that Hamilton Industrial Group had been used as a front to obtain bank loans and investment capital that was then diverted to the hidden network rather than being used for legitimate business purposes. Investors who thought they were buying stakes in a successful manufacturing company were actually funding shell companies that existed primarily to enrich Patricia and her children. Even more disturbing was the discovery that the network had been used to launder money from sources that the FBI was still investigating. Some of the financial flows appeared to originate from overseas accounts and shell companies that could potentially be connected to organized crime or other illegal activity. The scope of the investigation was expanding beyond corporate fraud into potential racketeering and money laundering charges that carried much more serious penalties. As the FBI investigation progressed, I received an unexpected phone call from Marcus that would provide the final piece of the puzzle I had been trying to solve. My stepbrother's voice was strained and nervous, very different from his usual confident demeanor, and he asked to meet with me privately to discuss what he called the family situation. "Jessica, I need to talk to you about what's been happening," Marcus said when we met at a coffee shop in downtown San Francisco. "I know you've been investigating the business, and I think there are things you need to know that might change how you understand everything." Marcus's willingness to meet with me was surprising, given that he was potentially facing criminal charges based on my investigation. I had agreed to the meeting only after consulting with Agent Rodriguez and arranging for FBI surveillance to ensure my safety during the conversation. "I want you to know that Victoria and I didn't choose any of this," Marcus began, his hands shaking slightly as he spoke. "We were kids when Mom and Dad started setting up the shell companies, and we didn't understand what was really happening until we were already too deep into it to get out safely." According to Marcus, the financial network had been Patricia's idea from the beginning, conceived as a way to protect assets from potential business failures or legal judgments against Hamilton Industrial Group. Initially, the plan had been relatively simple: create parallel companies that could hold valuable assets while maintaining the appearance that everything belonged to the main family business. But Mom got carried away with how well it was working, Marcus explained. "What started as asset protection turned into a way to avoid taxes, hide money from your mother during the divorce proceedings, and eventually became this massive system for stealing from other companies and investors." Marcus's account confirmed much of what I had discovered through my investigation, but it also revealed details about the family dynamics that I hadn't fully understood. According to him, Patricia had been the driving force behind the increasingly criminal activities, while my father had been a willing but somewhat reluctant participant, who was primarily motivated by greed rather than sophisticated criminal intent. "Dad knows enough about business to understand that what they're doing is illegal," Marcus said, "but Mom is the one who actually designed and managed the system. She's brilliant when it comes to corporate finance and tax law, and she's been using those skills to steal millions of dollars while making it look legitimate." The most shocking revelation in Marcus's account was that Patricia had been planning from the beginning to eventually eliminate my father from the business empire and transfer complete control to herself and her children. The network of shell companies had been designed not just to hide assets from regulators and tax authorities, but also to create a structure that would allow Patricia to take over the entire operation, while leaving my father with nothing but legal liability for the criminal activity. "Mom has been collecting evidence of Dad's involvement in the illegal activities for years," Marcus explained. "She's got recordings of conversations, copies of documents he signed, and financial records that would make him the primary target for prosecution while protecting herself and she's been planning to turn him in to the authorities once she had complete control of the assets." This revelation cast my father's behavior during the Christmas confrontation in an entirely new light. His anger and desperation hadn't just been about protecting his business empire from my investigation. He had been trying to prevent the exposure of activities that Patricia could use to destroy him while protecting herself and her children. Marcus's account also explained why my father had been so confident in threatening me and cutting me off from family resources. He had believed that Patricia was his ally in protecting the family's secrets, not realizing that she had been planning to betray him just as systematically as they had both betrayed me. "Jessica, there's something else you need to know," Marcus said, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. "Mom has been planning to frame you for some of the financial crimes. She's been using your name and professional credentials to legitimize transactions for years, and she's prepared to claim that you were the one who designed and managed the fraudulent activity." The revelation that Patricia had been planning to make me the scapegoat for her criminal activities was both terrifying and enraging. It explained why she had been so encouraging of my career in forensic accounting and why my father had been so interested in my professional development. They hadn't been proud of my achievements. They had been grooming me to take the fall for their crimes. "Marcus, why are you telling me this?" I asked, though I was grateful for the warning about Patricia's plans. "Because Victoria and I are scared," he admitted. "Mom is talking about eliminating anyone who could expose the network, and we think that includes us now that the FBI is investigating. She's been moving assets out of the companies we supposedly control, and we think she's planning to disappear and leave all of us to face prosecution for crimes she committed." Marcus's warning about Patricia's plans to eliminate potential witnesses was particularly chilling because it suggested that my safety concerns were well-founded. If Patricia was willing to frame me for crimes I hadn't committed and was planning to betray her own children to protect herself, she might be willing to take more direct action to prevent testimony that could expose her role in the criminal network. I immediately reported Marcus's warning to Agent Rodriguez, who took the threat seriously, and arranged for increased security measures to protect both my family and Marcus and Victoria. The FBI investigation expanded to include protective surveillance and began treating the case as a potential conspiracy involving witness intimidation and obstruction of justice. The final confrontation with my father and Patricia came sooner than anyone expected, triggered by Patricia's apparent decision that the FBI investigation posed too great a threat to her plans, and that she needed to take immediate action to protect herself. On a foggy Thursday morning in late March, I received a phone call from my father that would lead to the complete unraveling of the criminal network and the final revelation about who actually owned and controlled Hamilton Industrial Group. "Jessica, I need to see you immediately," my father said, his voice carrying a desperation I had never heard before. "Patricia is planning something that will destroy all of us, and I need your help to stop her before it's too late." The meeting with my father took place at a small cafe in Sausalito, chosen specifically because it was public enough to provide safety but quiet enough for a private conversation. Agent Rodriguez had arranged for undercover surveillance, and I wore a recording device that would capture everything my father said. David had wanted to accompany me, but the FBI believed that my father would be more likely to reveal crucial information if he thought we were speaking alone. When I arrived at the cafe, my father looked like he had aged a decade in the 3 months since Christmas. His usually immaculate appearance was disheveled, his face was drawn with stress, and his hands shook slightly as he reached for his coffee cup. The confident, commanding businessman who had built Hamilton Industrial Group into a regional powerhouse had been replaced by someone who looked genuinely frightened and desperate. "Jessica, thank you for coming," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know you have every reason to hate me after what happened at Christmas, but I need you to understand that everything I did was to protect you from Patricia's plan." His claim that excluding me from Christmas and threatening my career had been motivated by protection rather than hostility was difficult to accept, but I remained silent and allowed him to continue explaining his perspective on the events that had torn our family apart. "Patricia has been planning to destroy me from the moment we got married," my father continued, his words coming faster as his desperation became more apparent. "She used her financial expertise to convince me that the shell companies were necessary for tax planning and asset protection. But what she was really doing was building a parallel empire that she could control completely." According to my father's account, He had gradually realized over the past several years that Patricia had been systematically transferring control of the most valuable assets to herself and her children, while leaving him with legal liability for the fraudulent activity. By the time he understood the scope of her deception, he was so deeply implicated in criminal activities that he couldn't expose her without facing prosecution himself. When you started investigating Morrison Industries, Patricia panicked because she knew your skills were sophisticated enough to uncover the entire network, my father explained. She demanded that I cut you off from the family and threatened to frame you for the financial crimes if I didn't comply with her demand. The revelation that my exclusion from Christmas had been Patricia's idea rather than my father's spontaneous decision provided some small comfort, but it didn't excuse his willingness to threaten and abandon me to protect himself from his criminal activity. His explanation made clear that he viewed me as collateral damage in his conflict with Patricia rather than as a daughter whose interests deserved protection. Dad, even if Patricia forced you to exclude me from Christmas, you still participated in using my identity for fraudulent activities, I said, struggling to maintain my composure. You allowed my name and professional credentials to be used for crimes that could have destroyed my career and sent me to prison for activities I never performed. My father's face crumpled with what appeared to be genuine remorse, and for a moment I saw glimpses of the man who had raised me and encouraged my professional development. However, his response made clear that his primary concern remained protecting himself rather than taking responsibility for the harm he had caused. I was trapped, Jessica, he said, his voice breaking. Patricia had evidence that could send me to prison for decades, and she threatened to use it if I didn't cooperate with her plans. I thought if I could keep you away from the investigation, I could protect you from being implicated when everything collapsed. His explanation revealed the depth of his self-deception and his fundamental misunderstanding of my character and values. He had assumed that I would prioritize family loyalty over professional ethics, and that I would be willing to cover up criminal activities to protect family members. His strategy of threatening and excluding me had been based on the belief that I would eventually submit to his demands, rather than risk losing family relationships. What exactly is Patricia planning that made you decide to contact me now? I asked, though I suspected the answer involved the FBI investigation and her realization that law enforcement was closing in on the criminal network. My father glanced around the cafe nervously before leaning closer and lowering his voice even further. She's planning to disappear with the assets and leave all of us to face prosecution for her crimes, he whispered. She's been liquidating investments and transferring money to offshore accounts, and she's prepared to claim that Marcus, Victoria, you and I were the actual criminals while she was an innocent victim. This confirmation of Marcus's warnings about Patricia's plans was both validating and terrifying. The woman who had raised me as her own daughter and claimed to love me as family was prepared to destroy my life to protect herself from the consequences of her own criminal activity. She's already started implementing her plan, my father continued. Yesterday, she filed documents with the California Secretary of State, claiming that you have been the beneficial owner of Elena Holdings since its inception and that all the financial activities were conducted under your direction and supervision. The news that Patricia had already begun framing me for her crimes sent adrenaline coursing through my system and made the danger of my situation immediate and concrete. If her false documentation succeeded in convincing authorities that I was responsible for the criminal network, I could face decades in prison for crimes I hadn't committed. Dad, you need to tell me everything about the actual ownership structure of Hamilton Industrial Group and the entire network of shell companies, I said, recognizing that this might be my only opportunity to obtain crucial information from someone who had been involved since the beginning. My father's response would provide the final piece of the puzzle that had been driving my investigation for months, and reveal the ultimate truth about my family's business empire and my place within it. Jessica, there's something about the company ownership that I've never told you. My father began, his voice carrying a weight that suggested he was about to reveal information that would fundamentally change my understanding of everything. Hamilton Industrial Group was never actually mine to leave to anyone. The statement was so unexpected and contradicted everything I had believed about my father's business success that I initially thought I had misunderstood his words. Hamilton Industrial Group had been founded by my father, built through his efforts, and operated under his leadership for over 35 years. The idea that he wasn't the actual owner was impossible to reconcile with the public narrative of his entrepreneurial success. "What do you mean it was never yours?" I asked, though I was beginning to sense that his answer would reveal deceptions that went even deeper than what I had already uncovered. My father's explanation would expose the most carefully guarded secret of our family's history, and reveal why Patricia had been so confident in her ability to control the business empire while excluding me from any real inheritance. When I started Hamilton Industrial Group in 1987, I needed significant capital to purchase equipment and secure the initial contracts that would establish the business. My father began. I approached several investors and lenders, but the amounts I needed were beyond what traditional sources were willing to provide to an unproven entrepreneur. According to my father's account, the solution to his funding problem had come through Patricia, whom he had met several months before officially launching Hamilton Industrial Group. Patricia had connections in the investment banking world that allowed her to arrange financing from sources that were willing to provide large amounts of capital in exchange for ownership stakes, rather than traditional loan arrangements. Patricia arranged for a consortium of investors to provide the startup capital for Hamilton Industrial Group, my father continued. In exchange, they received majority ownership of the company, with the understanding that I would manage operations while they remained silent partners who would share in the profits, but not be involved in day-to-day management. The revelation that Hamilton Industrial Group had been funded and owned by outside investors from the beginning explained many of the puzzling aspects of the company's financial structure that I had discovered during my investigation. The complex network of shell companies hadn't been created to hide assets from my father's legitimate business. It had been designed to channel profits to the actual owners, while maintaining the fiction that my father was the entrepreneur who had built the company from scratch. "Who are these investors?" I asked, though I was beginning to suspect that the answer would reveal connections that extended far beyond legitimate business relationships. My father's reluctance to answer the question directly suggested that the sources of funding for Hamilton Industrial Group were even more problematic than the fraudulent activities I had already discovered. His eventual response would expose the criminal origins of our family's wealth and explain why Patricia had been so confident in her ability to eliminate anyone who threatened to expose the truth. "The investors prefer to remain anonymous," my father said carefully, "but they're associated with organizations that have substantial resources and very little tolerance for activities that might attract law enforcement attention." The euphemistic language my father used to describe the investors couldn't disguise the implication that Hamilton Industrial Group had been funded by criminal organizations that used legitimate businesses to launder money and hide assets from law enforcement. The company that had been the foundation of our family's social status and financial security had actually been a front for organized crime activities. "Dad, are you telling me that Hamilton Industrial Group has been a money laundering operation for organized crime for over 30 years?" I asked, though the evidence I had been uncovering during my investigation was beginning to make sense in this new context. My father's confirmation of my suspicions would explain not only the sophisticated financial structures I had discovered, but also the lengths to which Patricia had been willing to go to protect the secret ownership of the company. Exposing the criminal funding of Hamilton Industrial Group wouldn't just result in tax evasion and corporate fraud charges. It would bring down a major money laundering operation and potentially expose criminal organizations to law enforcement scrutiny. The investors have been very clear that anyone who threatens to expose their involvement in Hamilton Industrial Group will face consequences that extend far beyond legal prosecution, my father said, his voice barely audible. "Patricia has been working with them for years to ensure that the business continues to serve their needs while maintaining the appearance of legitimacy." This revelation cast Patricia's role in our family in an entirely new light. She hadn't just been my father's wife who had developed expertise in corporate finance. She had been an agent of criminal organizations who had been placed in our family to monitor and control a major money laundering operation. Her marriage to my father and her integration into our family had been part of a long-term strategy to ensure that Hamilton Industrial Group continued to serve the interests of its hidden criminal owner. "Patricia has been reporting on our family's activities to the investors for over 20 years, my father continued, his words revealing the depth of the deception that had shaped my entire childhood and adolescence. "She knew about your forensic accounting skills from the beginning, and she's been preparing to use you as a scapegoat if the money laundering operation was ever discovered. The realization that my stepmother had been a criminal operative who had been monitoring our family and planning to destroy me if necessary was both personally devastating and professionally enlightening. It explained her detailed knowledge of my career and her apparent pride in my professional development. She had been tracking my capabilities to determine how I could be used to protect or, if necessary, destroy the criminal operation. "Why are you telling me this now?" I asked, though I suspected that my father's decision to reveal the truth was motivated by his realization that Patricia's plans to frame me for criminal activities would inevitably lead to his own exposure and prosecution. "Because Patricia has decided that the FBI investigation poses too great a risk to the operation, and she's been authorized by the investors to eliminate anyone who could expose their involvement," my father said, his words confirming my worst fears about the danger I was facing. "She's planning to frame you for the financial crimes and then arrange for you to have an accident before you can provide testimony that would implicate the real owners of the company." The explicit threat to my physical safety transformed the situation from a complex white-collar crime investigation into a potential life-or-death struggle against criminal organizations with the resources and motivation to eliminate threats to their operation. My father's warning made clear that my investigation had uncovered far more than corporate fraud. It had exposed a major criminal enterprise that would use violence to protect itself. "Dad, if you know that Patricia is planning to harm me, you need to help the FBI stop her," I said, though I recognized that his involvement in the criminal activities for over 30 years made him an unlikely candidate for cooperation with law enforcement. My father's response would determine whether he was willing to prioritize my safety over his own self-preservation, and whether he retained enough conscience to take action against the criminal organization that had corrupted our family for decades. "I've already contacted Agent Rodriguez and arranged to provide complete cooperation with the FBI investigation," my father said, pulling out a cell phone and showing me recent text messages confirming his communication with law enforcement. "I'm prepared to testify about everything I know regarding the criminal funding of Hamilton Industrial Group and Patricia's role in managing the money laundering operation." The revelation that my father had already begun cooperating with the FBI was both surprising and encouraging, suggesting that his decision to meet with me was part of a larger strategy to expose the criminal network rather than simply an attempt to gain my sympathy or forgiveness. "Agent Rodriguez has been coordinating with federal prosecutors to arrange protective custody for our entire family," my father continued. "Patricia doesn't know that I've been cooperating with law enforcement, and the FBI is planning to arrest her and several other members of the criminal organization within the next few days." The news that law enforcement was preparing coordinated arrest provided some relief from the immediate threats to my safety, but it also highlighted the enormous scope of the criminal enterprise that my investigation had helped expose. The FBI operation would involve multiple agencies and potentially international cooperation to dismantle a money laundering network that had operated successfully for over 3 decades. "There's one more thing you need to know," my father said, his voice carrying a tone that suggested he was about to reveal information that would provide closure to the investigation that had consumed my life for months. "The actual legal owner of Hamilton Industrial Group, according to the corporate documents that were filed when the company was established, is Elena Holden." The revelation that my mother's namesake company was the legal owner of Hamilton Industrial Group was so unexpected that it took several moments for me to process the implication. If Elena Holdings owned Hamilton Industrial Group, and Elena Holdings was controlled by the criminal organization's network of shell companies, then the company I had been raised to believe would be my inheritance had never legally belonged to my father or our family. "But there's something Patricia and the criminal investors don't know," my father continued, a slight smile appearing on his face for the first time during our conversation. "When Elena Holdings was established, I was required to provide documentation of beneficial ownership for regulatory purposes. The documents I filed listed your mother as the beneficial owner based on her financial contribution to the initial startup capital." This revelation suggested that my mother had unknowingly been the legal owner of Hamilton Industrial Group for over 30 years, despite having no knowledge of the company's criminal funding or activity. If the corporate documents my father had filed were legally valid, then my mother's ownership stake could potentially provide a basis for challenging the criminal organization's control of the company. Your mother provided $50,000 from her graduate school savings to help fund the initial startup costs, my father explained. I listed her as the beneficial owner of Elena Holdings to satisfy regulatory requirements, but I never told her about the ownership stake because I was afraid she would ask questions about the other investors. The irony that my mother, who had been excluded from our family's business activities and had her identity stolen for criminal purposes, was actually the legal owner of the company was both poetic justice and potentially powerful evidence for the FBI's investigation. Her ownership stake could provide law enforcement with legal authority to seize control of Hamilton Industrial Group and its assets as part of their prosecution of the criminal organization. Dad, does Mom know about her ownership stake? I asked, though I suspected that my father had kept this secret for the same reasons he had concealed the criminal funding of the company. I've been afraid to tell her because I was worried that Patricia would find out and take action to eliminate her as a threat. My father admitted, but Agent Rodriguez has convinced me that your mother's safety depends on exposing the truth and using her ownership rights to help dismantle the criminal operation. The FBI's plan to use my mother's ownership stake as a legal basis for seizing control of Hamilton Industrial Group was both elegant and satisfying, allowing law enforcement to turn the criminal organization's own legal structures against them while protecting the legitimate rights of someone who had been victimized by their activities. Over the following week, the FBI operation to arrest Patricia and dismantle the criminal network unfolded with precision and coordination that demonstrated the extensive planning that had gone into the investigation. Patricia was arrested at the Hamilton Industrial Group headquarters while attempting to destroy financial records, and simultaneous raids were conducted at dozens of locations associated with the shell companies and their hidden assets. The arrests included several prominent business leaders and financial professionals who had been unknowingly facilitating the money laundering operation, as well as members of organized crime families who had been using Hamilton Industrial Group and its network of companies to hide and legitimize criminal proceeds. The scope of the operation made national news and exposed one of the largest and longest-running corporate money laundering schemes in California history. Marcus and Victoria were arrested as part of the initial sweep, but were released within days after agreeing to cooperate with prosecutors and provide testimony about Patricia's role in recruiting them into the criminal activities. Their cooperation confirmed much of what my investigation had revealed and provided additional evidence about the sophistication and scope of the money laundering operation. My mother flew to California immediately after learning about her ownership stake in Hamilton Industrial Group and worked with federal prosecutors to transfer control of the company to a court-appointed trustee who would manage its operations while the criminal investigation proceeded. Her ownership rights provided law enforcement with clear legal authority to seize assets and prevent the criminal organization from destroying evidence or hiding additional resources. The revelation of my mother's ownership also provided a resolution to the question of my inheritance that had been one of the driving forces behind my investigation. As my mother's heir, I would eventually inherit legitimate ownership of Hamilton Industrial Group after it had been separated from the criminal activities and restructured as a lawful business enterprise. 6 months after the FBI arrests, Patricia was convicted on multiple federal charges including money laundering, racketeering, identity theft, and conspiracy to commit murder in connection with her plans to eliminate witnesses. She was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole, ensuring that she would spend the rest of her productive life behind bars. My father's cooperation with law enforcement resulted in a more lenient sentence of 5 years in federal prison, followed by supervised probation and community service. His testimony was crucial in convicting several higher-level members of the criminal organization and dismantling money laundering operations that extended far beyond Hamilton Industrial Group. The legal resolution of the criminal cases provided closure to the investigation that had dominated my life for over a year. But the personal transformation that resulted from exposing my family's secrets continued to shape my career and relationships long after the prosecutions were completed. I founded the Elena Chen Institute for Corporate Integrity, a nonprofit organization dedicated to training forensic accountants and providing resources for investigating complex financial crime. The institute offered scholarships for students from immigrant families and provided pro bono investigative services for law enforcement agencies that lacked resources to pursue sophisticated white-collar crime. The work of the institute attracted attention from legal professionals and law enforcement agencies throughout the country, leading to consulting opportunities and speaking engagements that allowed me to share the lessons learned from my family's case with others who were working to combat financial crime. David and I used the settlement funds from civil lawsuits against the criminal organization to purchase a larger home in Marin County, not far from the estate where I had been excluded from Christmas dinner just 2 years earlier. The property became a retreat center for the institute, hosting training programs and conferences that brought together professionals from around the world to share expertise in financial crime investigation. My relationship with my mother deepened significantly as we worked together to rebuild Hamilton Industrial Group as a legitimate business enterprise focused on manufacturing and renewable energy development. Her mathematical expertise and my investigative skills proved to be a powerful combination for identifying and eliminating the remaining traces of criminal activity from the company's operation. Marcus and Victoria gradually rebuilt their lives after their release from federal supervision, with Marcus pursuing his music career and Victoria developing a nonprofit organization focused on helping families affected by white-collar crime. Our relationships remained complicated by the history of deception and betrayal, but we maintained contact and supported each other's efforts to create positive outcomes from our shared trauma. The transformation of Hamilton Industrial Group from a money laundering front into a legitimate business enterprise became a case study that was taught in business schools and law enforcement training programs. The company's commitment to transparency and ethical business practices made it a model for corporate responsibility and demonstrated that organizations could recover from criminal involvement and become forces for positive change. My work with the Elena Chen Institute led to a marriage proposal from David that included a commitment to continue our shared dedication to fighting financial crimes and supporting victims of corporate fraud. Our wedding was held at the Institute's retreat center, surrounded by colleagues and friends who had supported our work and shared our values. The ceremony included readings from my grandmother's letter, which my mother had saved and which revealed her own experiences with financial manipulation and her determination to ensure that future generations of women would have the knowledge and resources to protect themselves from economic abuse. As I stood at the altar with David, I was surrounded by the people who had helped me transform personal trauma into professional purpose. I reflected on the journey that had brought me from a shocked daughter being excluded from Christmas dinner to a national expert on corporate fraud and financial crimes investigation. The inheritance that I had thought I was losing when my father banned me from Christmas had been replaced by something far more valuable: the knowledge and expertise to protect other families from the kind of deception and betrayal that had shaped my own life. The Elena Chen Institute and its work represented a legacy that extended far beyond any individual business or financial asset. 2 years after Patricia's conviction, I received an invitation to testify before a congressional committee that was considering legislation to strengthen oversight of corporate ownership, disclosure, and money laundering prevention. The opportunity to influence policy at the national level represented the culmination of the journey that had begun with my investigation of Morrison Industries and my determination to uncover the truth about my family's business empire. My testimony before Congress included recommendations for regulatory changes that would make it more difficult for criminal organizations to use legitimate businesses for money laundering and would provide better protection for whistleblowers who expose financial crime. The legislation that resulted from the hearings included several provisions that were directly based on lessons learned from the Hamilton Industrial Group case. The work continued to expand as other families and organizations reached out for help with similar investigations, and the Institute developed training programs and resources that were adopted by law enforcement agencies and educational institutions throughout the country. The personal betrayal that had shattered my understanding of my family had become the foundation for a career dedicated to preventing other families from experiencing similar trauma. Standing in my office at the Institute 5 years after that devastating Christmas confrontation, looking out at the San Francisco Bay where my journey had begun, I felt profound gratitude for the strength and resilience that had carried me through the investigation and its aftermath. The woman who had been excluded from her family's celebration had become someone who was creating new traditions and new definitions of family based on shared values rather than shared deception. The trust that had been destroyed by my father's betrayal had been rebuilt through relationships with colleagues, clients, and community members who valued honesty and integrity above family loyalty or financial success. The inheritance that I had thought I was losing had been replaced by work that provided meaning and purpose that no amount of money could have purchased. My mother's ownership of Hamilton Industrial Group had provided the legal foundation for rebuilding the company, but the real transformation had come through the commitment to transparency and ethical business practices that guided every aspect of its operation. The company that had been founded as a criminal enterprise had become a symbol of redemption and positive change. The Institute's work continued to evolve and expand, with new programs and initiatives that reflected emerging trends in financial crimes and the changing needs of law enforcement and regulatory agencies. Each case that we investigated and each professional that we trained represented another step toward a world where financial deception would be harder to hide and easier to prosecute. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.